In this video, I'm going to show you a few ways in which we can add atmospheric flare effects to our images in Photoshop. Now, this is my starting image here, so you can see it's a nice landscape, but I think overall it's looking a bit dull, and we could perhaps add a bit more impact to our image by creating a few sun flare effects to come up with an effect like this. So let's get cracking here. We'll go back to our starting image here, and the first thing I'm going to do here is bring up my layers panel by going to Window, Layers here in Photoshop, and the first of the three lens flare effects I'm going to add here involves using the Photoshop filter. So to use the filter, I'm going to make a new layer first and set it to screen. So I'm going to make a new layer here. I'm going to fill it with black, so I can hit D and then Alt and Backspace, which is the keyboard shortcut to fill a layer with your current foreground color, which is black. That gives me a black layer. If I set this layer to the screen blend mode here in the layers panel, that hides everything on that layer because screen only reveals pixels that are the same or brighter than those below. So all the pixels below are brighter, so effectively that layer disappears. But I can use this layer to add my lens flare effect. I can right click it here and convert it to a smart object, because that way I can apply my Photoshop filter here non-destructively, and then I can go to Filter, Render, and Lens Flare. Now you see we have a little dialog here, and we can control the point of our lens flare by dragging around. So of course with my image here, I'd like the center point of the flare here to match up to where the sun is setting on the horizon here in my landscape. So I'm going to guess it to be around about there. I can control the brightness of my lens flare as well using the slider here, and I'll hit OK and we'll see how that looks. Now that's looking slightly too low, so the good thing about applying this as a smart filter is we can always double click our lens flare filter here in the layers panel, and that allows me to re-enter those settings, and I just need to drag it upwards slightly, and let's try again, and that's looking better. And that's really all there is to it with the lens flare filter, apart from you can choose from different lens types here, but it's all very simple, and because of that you see it getting used quite a lot. So if you want a more refined flare effect, then you might need to delve further into Photoshop's tools and settings to come up with something that looks a bit more unique. And with my image here, I feel it's looking a little bit fake. I think I'd like to add to the effect and adjust it. So to begin with, I think the circles here are looking a little bit too sharp, so I'd like to blur them. So I'm going to right click my layer here now and rasterize layer, and that allows me to add another filter effect. So now I'm going to go to Filter and Blur. In fact, before I do that, again, I'm going to right click it and convert it to a smart object just to keep it non-destructive, and then I'll go to Filter, Blur, and we'll use Gaussian Blur. And you can see now I can blur those circles, and this just, to me, looks a bit more natural rather than those really sharp circles that seemed a bit fake. If I toggle that top layer now off or on, you can see now my flare is starting to take shape. But I can go further now by using different flare effects. So I can this time add a gradient layer here by clicking the adjustment layer icon here at the bottom of the layers panel. We can select gradient, and then I'm going to go to my gradient presets here. I'm going to choose this second option here for a solid to transparent gradient, and I can just click within the gradient preview box here to open the gradient editor, and this allows me to add color stops to my gradients. So I can go to the black to white gradient here, and you see we have these little boxes here, and I can double click the box here to open up the color picker, and I can choose a color for my gradient. So I could perhaps choose an orange color for my gradient like this, and I can maybe add another stop by double clicking halfway along the line and perhaps tweak the colors here, maybe make it slightly more yellow as it goes towards transparency. So let's give that gradient a go, and you can see that gives me this orangey yellow gradient. Now at the moment it's set to linear, but we can change this to radial. I can also go here and uncheck align with layer, and then I can click and drag to move the center point of my circular gradient. So I can again position it over the sun here. I'll hit OK, and then I can change the blend mode here. Let's perhaps go for the screen blend mode, and if I toggle that layer off and on, you can see how that gives me a really nice color change around the sun here, just to add to my flare effect. Of course, with any of these layers, we can also adjust the layer opacity if we think it's too strong. So I could perhaps lower the opacity of my lens flare layer there, and I can go to the top layer and lower the opacity of that layer as well to tone it down. I can also just double click to go back into my gradient fill settings. I can adjust the scale here, so I can make it slightly smaller if I want a slightly smaller flare there. That's looking a little bit too small, so I'll up the scale to around about I think maybe somewhere around about 80 or 90 is working for me. And of course, if we like, we can highlight the layer mask that's attached to that layer by clicking the white rectangle here. Then I can grab my brush tool and I can paint with black if I want to hide parts of the effect. So I'm going to lower my layer opacity to 30% by hitting 3 on my keyboard, and I can just paint over the land here. In fact, let's undo that. I'm just going to right click and choose 0% hardness here for my brush, and then just paint, and you can see I'm able to hide parts of the flare effect if I think it's too strong over the land here. Now for my final flare effect, I'm going to use the shape tool. So I'm going to go to my custom shape tool down here by clicking and holding on my shape tool options, and then in the shape options here, there's a star effect. In fact, there are a few different star effects. I'm going to use this one here, this sort of multi-pronged star, and I'm just going to drag a star shape. I can hold shift to keep the proportions aligned, and then I'm going to go to the fill box here. I'm going to fill it with an orange color. In fact, I can choose that same orange color as before here. Now I can go to my direct selection tool, which is this arrow tool here in the toolbar, and then I can hold command or control, and I can click on these points here on my star, and I'm going to drag this point outwards. I can hold shift while dragging. I'm just going to make it a long point there. I'm going to do the same with this point. I'm going to hold command or control, click on it. That's command on the Mac, control on Windows, click on it, then drag outwards to make sort of 2 elongated prongs on my star like that. And that's the sort of shape I'm after. Now I'm going to right click it and rasterize it, and then I'm going to blur it. So I'm going to go to, in fact, again, as before, I'll right click and convert it to a smart object first. And I'm going to go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur once more. And I'll blur it somewhere around about there, I think will work. And I'm going to change the blend mode here to screen. And then if I use my move tool, I can click and drag it over towards the sun over here. And that's looking pretty good. I think it needs blurring slightly more, so I can just double click the Gaussian blur filter we added and then blur it until I get the effect that I'm after, like that. And perhaps lower the layer opacity slightly to blend it in with everything else. And if I toggle that top layer off or on, you can see now we're just adding to our flare effect with a few of these nice streaks around the sun. So that's 3 ways in which we can add flare to our images. Let's go back through them. First of all, we had our lens flare filter here, which we blurred. We then added a gradient effect around the sun, a radial gradient, and then we created our own flare using a custom shape. And I think to finish off, I'm going to add a color balance adjustment layer here. So we'll go down to color balance here, and I'll just skew the color slightly towards red and towards yellow. And then also perhaps go to my shadows and skew those towards red as well, and add a touch of yellow into the shadows just to enhance that sunset feel. And that's my finished image.